Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for the beginning of my one-turn example of play for Fire in the Sky, the Great Pacific War. Now I've laid out the map and I've placed the various units in their starting positions for the January 1942 scenario. In the rulebook, this is referred to as the so-called short campaign scenario. And the reason I've chosen to start in January 1942 is while the December 1941 campaign game is a useful one that gives you a lot of opportunities to talk about how the game works, and to explain the different stages of a turn as it's played out. It's slightly uninteresting for the Allied player because, of course, it's very carefully constructed not to ensure a Japanese victory, but to recreate the conditions that allowed the Japanese to capitalize on their inherent advantages at the start of the Pacific War, mainly that of surprise and their ability to deploy rapidly across multiple fronts, and also the regrettably supine Allied reaction to the initial assaults. Those are all carefully built into the rules. As I say, it doesn't guarantee a Japanese victory. In fact, far from it. If the Japanese don't play well or if they suffer some bad dice rolls, it could have an impact on the rest of the war. So there's another reason to start in January 1942. So starting on this turn, the Allies get to do a little bit in return. They're not just sitting there taking the punches. To a very limited degree, they're beginning to fight back. I'll only say that unfortunately this is one of those games whose lovely, lovely big map sort of extends beyond the capacities of my poor camera phone to sort of cover it all in one go. So I'm going to try to give you all a summary of the strategic situation before I start zooming in here, there, and everywhere. So just to introduce you to the complete map board, you can see those red boxes up there. Those are the holding boxes for the two major Japanese bases, Kure and Yokosuka. To the bottom left, you can see the turn track with the turn marker and the reinforcements for both sides deployed underneath it for now. And you'll notice along the right hand side of the map is a track. Now, this is a general track for all sorts of markers. The Japanese merchant pool, the transport points available for the three contending sides, the availability of Japanese oil points, both sides submarine points. It tracks a few things. So I'll refer to that as I go, and hopefully it won't give anyone sort of vertigo or air sickness as I keep zooming in and out. But just to give you a brief summary, those of you who aren't familiar with this stage of the Pacific War, of what the strategic position is as of January 1942. So the Japanese have launched their lightning offensives across the Pacific and East Asia. On the Asian mainland, the 15th Army over there has secured Thailand and is getting ready for an advance into Burma. In Malaya, the Japanese 25th Army under General Yamashita is finishing off the battered remnants of the poor British Malayan army. So I'm afraid the RAF has been swept from the skies and Force Z has been destroyed. But the remnants of Malaya Command are holding out. Borneo has fallen to the Japanese in a fairly swift and easy manner, but the Dutch are preparing their defences further south. In the Philippines, a very similar struggle is going on to that playing out in Malaya. Masaharu Homa's 14th Army is giving poor old General MacArthur's army a bit of a kicking. So they're not gone yet, but things are not looking good. And in both instances, Malaya and the Philippines, the Japanese have formidable air forces available to lend distant support. Down in the South Pacific, Rabaul has been seized in a lightning op, and although the Allies do hold positions in the surrounding areas, they are weakly held. So The Japanese are slightly running out of puff down here, but they equally, the Allies are not really in a position to go on a counter-offensive just yet. However, they are gathering their strength. The small but plucky Royal Australian Navy is ready to help hold the waterways between Australia and Port Moresby, and at least one US carrier force is in position at Noumea, ready to try and contest further moves into the South Pacific. In the Central Pacific, the Japanese have, of course, occupied Wake Island and integrated it into their overall defense. But again, here they've become rather stretched. They're running out of puff. And one thing that this game is notable for is making the Japanese player realize the value of logistics. The Allies, in a way, don't have to worry so much. So, for example, they always have oil on tap, as long as they can keep their supply lines open. For the Japanese, it's a much more scarce commodity. Of course, the remnants of I'll say the undamaged remnants of the US Navy are still at Pearl Harbor, and the air garrison at Midway has been, at Midway has been reinforced. Those of you who have been keeping an eye on the board might wonder where the Imperial Navy is. That is an excellent question. And I'm just going to give you a quick look over there. So that is the Kure holding box, which pretty much holds the entire Imperial Navy at the moment. They're preparing for future operations, but everyone has come home temporarily. And there's significant ground forces waiting at Kure as well for future deployments. Around this theatre of war, wherever the Japanese see fit to send them. So that's the strategic position at the outset of this turn. And so what you do each turn, there's a rigid sequence of play which applies to both players. The Japanese go first, they run through their entire sequence, followed by the Allied player. And what I'll do is I'll just very quickly zoom in on this part of the map. As you can see, the sequence of play is very nicely summarized for both players, and additional details that you may need to know are covered in the handy sheets that both players have got. So let's start with the Japanese turn and the transport phase. So the transport phase is important for the Japanese player because this is the phase in which he makes certain decisions about his logistics, and particularly oil. There are 3 oil-producing regions on the map, or at least major oil transport hubs, if I can call them that. You've got Singapore. You've got Indonesia down there, represented by Surabaya, and you've got Borneo. Now, so far, the Japanese only hold Borneo. Each turn, they can transport up to 4 oil points from each conquered oil-producing region back to Japan, but it's subject to how many merchant vessels they have left. Now, at this stage in the game, the Japanese merchant pool is still at 30. And on each turn, they are allowed to use half their available merchant ships, rounding down, to transport oil. So in theory, they could transport 15 points of oil. However, the merchantment pool is only one thing that the Japanese have to worry about. The other is how many transport points they have left over from the previous turn's play. And in this scenario, they start with only 4 unused transport points. That's pretty significant because, of course, much of Japan's merchant marine has been busily engaged supporting military operations in December 1941. So here, they only have the capacity to transport 4 oil points. However, they do know that later on in their reinforcement phase, the transport points are going to be reset to match their current merchantman pool. So they are going to spend all their available transport points in order to increase their oil reserve by 4. So it's a straight exchange. 4 transport points brings 4 oil points to the home islands. The other decision they have to make is whether they want to reallocate any of their destroyers to convoy escort. Now there's a little box there marked Japanese convoy escort, and each turn the Japanese are given the option of transferring destroyers from anywhere on the board to the escort duty. So it's an abstraction of Japan's assignment of warships to this duty. Now, playing in character for the Japanese, they're fairly contemptuous of Allied capabilities in the wake of their easy victories so far. And given that in real life they didn't get round to organising a proper strategic escort command until late 1943, and I'm being a bit generous there, I am not going to waste precious combatant destroyers on the utterly dishonourable and unnecessary task of guarding the Emperor's merchant ships. There's no need. So the Japanese will allocate no destroyers to convoy protection duties this turn. And that is the transport phase done. So moving on to the reinforcement phase, the Japanese can have a look under the turn counter and see what they have available. This turn, they receive 2 air points. Now this is an abstraction of your overall air forces. They can represent either a small group of aircraft in the early war period or a large air corps later on. But it's abstracted, it works fairly well in the game system. Using the optional rules, the Japanese can decide to either bring these in immediately as land forces, or they can commit them to training as naval air replacements on a future turn. Now the temptation for the Japanese is to bring them in straight away as land-based air, but looking at the strategic situation overall, I don't know how well you can see at this distance, sorry about that, but the Japanese do have a lot of air units already in play, and they enjoy a fairly overwhelming superiority over the Allied forces at the moment. So rather than bringing in 2 more air points, as the Japanese player, I am going to commit them to the turn track, and I'm going to put them on turn 6, which is the January 1943 turn. So what I've done by doing that is I've committed them to naval training to turn them into qualified carrier pilots. Now, why have I done this? Well, the very important reason is the Imperial Navy needs its Sea Eagles. Whenever a Japanese aircraft carrier is commissioned or returns from battle with damage, it is placed in the carriers without planes boxes here, and they are forced to replenish or take on board for the first time trained naval aviators from this pool. Now this is very important because while the Allies commission carriers complete with air crews, the Japanese have to make sure they have trained air crew set aside, as well as the aircraft for them. And I like this rule because it simulates the shortage of qualified and well-trained carrier pilots that the Japanese had, especially once losses began to bite by the end of 1942. So if as the Japanese player you merrily go through the game not bothering to set aside air units, particularly if you're using the optional rules, you will suffer for it later. So while it does mean I deprive myself of 2 air points in the short term, it does mean I could be saving the carrier fleet's bacon later on. So I've made my decision and these fellows go away. In the context of this demonstration, we won't see them again. The next thing the Japanese do is they reset their submarine points. Now, they didn't use any of their submarine points the previous turn, so it's reset to 2. Their submarines always are at level 2. Only the US Navy increases its submarine commitment as the game goes on. So having done that, I'll just move over here so you can see. I now reset my transport points. The Japanese transport points every turn are reset to the level of their current merchantman pool. So that's still at 30. Japanese merchant marine losses have not been significant so far. I'd be surprised if they were in January 1942, but later on in the game, losses will make themselves felt as the US submarine capabilities become greater. And lastly, to end the reinforcement phase, a player has the choice of bringing in replacements markers. Now, just so you show you some examples from the Allied pile, replacements are effectively the same as regular ground combat units, except they cannot initiate combat and they cannot occupy any bases. Enemy bases. Their sole function in this game is to top up damaged units. The Japanese will not bring in any replacements this turn because there are no ground combat units that have been reduced in strength. But had they done so, had they needed to do this, the replacements would have started in the home bases, either Kure and or Yokosuka, and they would have then had to have been transported to wherever they needed to be. But as I say, the Japanese have no need to do that this turn, so they will leave it. There is incidentally no cost for bringing these in. You can bring in as many as you like up to your counter mix, but they have to be safely transported to their destination, and that does cost you transportation points. And for the Japanese, that can be particularly painful. The other thing is, at the end of your turn, any replacements that have not been used to top up damaged ground units simply disappear. You have to bring them in again next turn if they're needed. So moving on from the reinforcement phase, the next phase is called the first deployment phase. You get 2 deployments every turn before and after your operational movements and your combat. So in the first deployment phase, the first thing you can do is called 1 hex deployment. This is in effect a free movement of your forces. So I'm going to go round the different sections of the board where the Japanese do want to do a 1 hex deployment. So Bangkok fell under Japanese control the previous turn, which means that their supply lines down to Saigon are secure. And so 15th Army is now free to commence its advance towards Rangoon, which is what they will do. So that's a free movement. A 1 hex deployment doesn't cost you any transport points. There'll be no such deployments down here. 25th Army is still bogged down in its fight with the British. And Kawaguchi's forces, this small infantry unit here, there's nowhere they can go to. Movement by land has to be along these connecting lines. And movement by sea would be possible in a 1-hex deployment, but you have to have a base to go to. So if they wanted to, they could return to Saigon, but there's not really any point in them doing so because they're really meant to be prepping for further offensive moves in the south, so they'll stay where they are. Similarly, down in the Solomons, the Japanese have a fairly strong infantry unit, or ground unit I should say, backed up by air, but they can't use a seaborne 1-hex deployment if they're going to end up attacking someone. You can only do that over a land connection. They'll have to wait to the next phase if they want to carry out any seaborne assaults. To be honest, at this stage, it's probably not worth the risk anyway. And of course, in the Central Pacific, nobody's going to be doing 1-hex deployments for fairly obvious reasons. If they wanted to, the aircraft based in the Marshall Islands could 1-hex deploy to the Gilberts, but there's not really much point in them doing so, not at this stage at any rate. Besides, from the Marshalls, they're a bit more central, and it puts them in a better position to support operations either towards the Ellis Islands or towards the New Guinea, Guadalcanal, Rabaul sector. So that's all the Japanese will do for their first deployment. Now we come to operational movement. Oh wait, I forgot to mention, in addition to 1-hex deployment, you can conduct movement using your transport points. And the Japanese will do some of this because they want to set some units up for future operations. So they're going to have a look at their options and see whether they want to shuffle anybody around. They certainly would like to, with these infantry units in the home islands, because there's a limited range by which you can move operationally, and there's nowhere that these units can reach if they just stay in the home islands. So they're going to use some transport points to redistribute these fellows. And because the going is so good, they're going to go a little bit crazy this turn. So the Japanese player consults his transport costs chart. And as we're not doing operational movement, we're doing sea deployment, transport. It costs half a transport point to, it costs half the normal amount of transport points to move these units. So had the Japanese been conducting operational movement, it would have cost 4 transport points to move that unit. But as they're doing deployment, it only costs 2 per unit. So it's a much cheaper way of getting them about and setting them up for future offensives. But where to send them? That's the tricky question. The Japanese decide that they're going to want to send 1 unit to perhaps, they're going to send another infantry unit to Saigon, and that's in preparation for supporting operations in the East Indies. Another unit is going to be sent to Rabaul, and this is very, very tricky. Here we run up against stacking limits. It is tempting to stack these fellows together, but bases with a green shading are islands, or atolls, and they have a stacking limit which is only 4. So some of them are already a bit crowded to be able to accept these guys. So I'm going to have to think carefully about this. I'm also going to have to think about the transport costs. Because looking again at the transport cost chart, you pay the cost of movement, but it only covers your movement from 1 to 4 hexes. So if I return to the first deployment I was considering, let's say sending the 43rd Division from Kure to Saigon, we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, it might be cheaper. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not by much. No, we're just going to have to bite the bullet on that one. So the Japanese decide to send the 43rd to Borneo, and it ends up costing them 4 transport points. So I'll pick up this token and move it down the tracker. So having started the turn with 30 transport points, Japan now has 26. The next deployment I'm going to make will be to send the 2nd Division down to Rabaul. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4. You have to stop off at a friendly base on the way if it's a multi-legged journey. Then 1, 2. So that division has arrived in Rabaul, but it has cost the Japanese another 4 transport points, and they're down to 22 now. I think, on reflection, it might be worth keeping a hold on these two just in case, because it occurs to me that while I did want to be very ambitious and spread Japan's military strength out for a whole load of epic advances, I have to remain aware that those transport points will also be needed to prepare naval units for offensives, and some of them will be needed the next turn in order to transport oil. Those considerations aside, I am feeling rather confident. And I also want to make sure there's garrisons in place to exploit future advances. The game is won on the strength of victory points. The Japanese have 5 victory points at the moment, thanks to their existing conquests. So they're reasonably on the way. Of course, once the Allies start counter-attacking and contesting Japanese gains, the prospect of reaching that magic number of 20 gets fainter and fainter. So maybe now is the time to strike while the going is good. Do you know what? Enough dithering. I'm going to commit these 2 divisions. I'm going to place one of them in Palau, which can accommodate them, and the other one can go to Truk. So you see, while preparing for a offensive in the South Pacific, I'm also readying units to complete the capture of New Guinea and also of Leyte. So because these 2 locations were only 4 hexes away from Kure, they only cost me 2 transport points each, so that wasn't quite so bad. However, I'm mindful that Japan only has 18 transport points left. So that completes the deployment for infantry. Now the next question is, do I want to redeploy any aircraft? I might have to have a think about that. And if you heard that rattle, that was me throwing my dice on the floor. One moment. Okay, we're all sorted there. Sorry about that. So, what else do I want to prepare? Obviously, there's going to have to be some naval support for some of these offensives. So, looking at who I've got, I have, of course, the famous Kido Butai, the carrier strike force, and I want to make use of them. And I think, behaving historically again, I would like them to support some operations in the South Pacific. So I am going to send them to Truk Lagoon. Now it's a distance of 4 hexes, which is good, because I'll be using transport points to move them rather than oil points. So how much does it cost to send these fellows? Each counter has a transport cost number. So the total to send all 6 carriers with the battleships Hiei and Kirishima in support, 7.5 transport points. And I will send them off to Truk. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've 10.5 transport points left. It's getting a bit tight. Just in case you're wondering, how do you represent half a point in this game, or even quarters and 3/4? You simply rotate the counter. So 10.5 is represented by the transport points counter being turned that way. And the way it works is 3/4, half, 1/4, well, 10.25, and then just plain 10. So Japan has 10.5 transport points available. I think I may call... Actually, do I want to call a halt yet? Or do I think I can get by with a turn where I have enough transport to bring in more oil? This is where it gets tricky for the Japanese player, juggling the balance between his transport capability and the precious fuel oil which fuels his naval operations. And it's a very difficult question. I think it may just be worth sending a few destroyers just to beef up operations elsewhere. Maybe a cruiser or 2. Okay, I've decided I might send a little bit more than that. So I'm going to move the light carriers Zuiho and Shoho, a couple of Furutaka class cruisers, and 2 groups of destroyers into Southeast Asian waters. So looking at the transport cost, we have 1, 2, and the destroyers are half each. So Japan has 7.5 transport points left for me moving them. 1, 2, 3. Where to send them? I think I shall send them to Hainan Island, because that keeps the cost of transport down and still puts them within striking range of the active theatre. So we shall do that. So now we come to operational movement. This is where I start quite literally burning oil. The army in Burma has already moved, so I don't need to push them any further. The 25th Army can stay where it is, because I'm quite happy with how things are going there. I don't particularly feel the need to do them any more reinforcements, because they've got plenty of aircraft backing them up. Those units are now in position, ready to develop the offensive against the Dutch when we're ready to move forward. I might be a bit cautious and not do it this turn. In the Philippines, General Homer is similarly still engaged in his fight with MacArthur. But I do want to get some easy wins where I can. So what I am going to do is conduct an operational movement using Kawaguchi's division, and I'm going to use them for an amphibious landing on Leyte. And I'm similarly, if I've got the transport points for it, I am going to risk... Oh, actually, am I? I was going to say I was going to risk a landing on northern New Guinea, but that may be too much too soon. And the reason I say that is there are Allied naval units down here which could react. I do have an aerial zone of control, however, so the danger is lessened somewhat. I also have to remain aware that there are Dutch naval forces over there that may try to react to any move I make. So this may take some care and planning. I think to support the Leyte operation, I'm going to turn these ships from Hainan Island to their active side and send them off. So as it's the operational movement phase, this transport cost is now the cost in oil to send them out. So it's a total of 3. And they can deploy to cover the landing forces which are going to be landing at Leyte. And Japan has 13 oil points left. Now, the question is, shall I proceed with my New Guinea landings, or shall I wait for a more favourable opportunity? I think I shall take the risk. But I think I shall only take the risk with the division which is currently at Truck Lagoon. Now, to launch an amphibious invasion, you have to be 2 hexes away from a friendly base. So that's how I was able to launch the assault on Leyte. And from Truk, we're going to head for Lae, which is nominally Australian but is uncontrolled at the moment. So I'm going to pay the transport costs for that invasion. And I really must stop there because the Japanese only have 3.5 transport points left available. And I'm not going to leave them totally unsupported, just in case. Question is, do I want to send out the whole of Kido Butai or just a part of it? I'm actually not too worried about Allied reaction because we do have air cover over there. So I am going to save my oil and risk the invasion forces not being interfered with too much, I hope. Those air units at Port Moresby may pose a threat, but I do have aircraft of my own there. So that's it. I'll leave it at that for Japanese offensive moves. We now get to the Allied reaction phase. Now, only naval units can react, and the Allies have to be careful because they've got precious few of those. I'd mentioned that the Dutch naval forces are still present at Surabaya, and they could react. In fact, they can react up to half. Reaction allows the Allies to, and indeed the Japanese, if they react on their opportunity to do so, up to half their movement points. So the Dutch could react to that invasion of Leyte, but there's quite a bit of Japanese strength concentrated there, and they're very painfully aware that they'll be needing to defend their own colony fairly soon. So with due apologies to the United States, the Dutch will sit tight and not intervene on this one. That invasion over there is just outside their range, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4. They can't cut round the edge of New Guinea, so that one is safe from Dutch interference. It wouldn't normally be safe from the US carriers based down in Noumea, but the Japanese do have an aerial zone of control, which would prevent them, even relying on friendly aircraft, from reacting towards that hex. So actually it was quite a viable thing for me to try and pull off. So that can go ahead. There's no other Japanese moves in the Central Pacific which the Allies will want to react to. So that is the end of the of the Allied reaction phase. Now we get to the air commitment phase. And what happens in the air commitment phase is that aerial units adjacent to combat zones can lend their support, as can aircraft that are accompanying invasion forces on carriers. So all the aircraft in Saigon are going to support the ongoing campaign in Malaya, and I'm just going to tilt them that way as a reminder that that's what they're doing. Similarly, all the aircraft in Formosa are going to pitch in to try and help finish off US resistance in the Philippines. I do have the light carrier here at Leyte, but as no Allied units attempted to intervene, then they don't really have anything to do really other than oversee a safe landing. The Japanese could commit these aircraft offensively against one of the Allied positions over there, but I don't think there's much point to doing so at this stage because those allied units are quite weak, but by launching long-range attacks, I risk losses that would not really bring me any long-term gain. So I'm not going to rock that particular boat as the Japanese. So we've completed the air commitment phase, and normally the next stage would be Japanese combat. Now I've realized this has gone on for quite a while, this video, so I'm actually going to stop it there, and I will start off the next video with the Japanese combat phase and end the Japanese turn, and then we'll rattle straight into the Allied side of the turn. But I hope you've enjoyed that, and I hope you found it interesting and a reasonable explanation of how this game works. Turns normally proceed faster than this. It's just that this game has multiple steps, and each one of them, because they're quite distinct, has to have a bit of an explanation to it, and I'm afraid that's what's dragged this out a little bit more than I was anticipating. But as I say, I hope you found that enjoyable, and I hope you found it useful. It's certainly bringing back many happy memories for me of when I first got this game and played it over and over and over. And I'm very interested to see whether the various Japanese offensives succeed, because if we follow the history, Singapore really does need to fall within the scope of this turn, as does Rangoon. If the US does well, the Philippines may hold out for another turn, but that remains to be seen. But anyway, I would just like to thank you all for following this series and watching this video. As always, it's really, really great to have your company. And I hope you like these videos as much as I've enjoyed making them. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one when I continue the demo playthrough of Fire in the Sky, the Great Pacific War. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.